So welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Yedida Ganak. On behalf of the guidance departments in the elementary schools in Bergen County, we'd like to thank you for joining us this evening. I'd like to thank Ohel and especially Dr. Blumenthal for taking the time to speak with us tonight. Dr. Blumenthal is Ohel's director of the Center for Trauma, Bereavement, and Crisis Response. Dr. Blumenthal is a renowned trauma expert who's helped many of our communities in times of crisis. His guidance and wisdom have been invaluable during this challenging time. Dr. Blumenthal does encourage questions during this talk. Please feel free to use the chat function, either privately or to the whole group, and he'll try to address your questions. Thank you, Dr. Blumenthal. We look forward to hearing you speak tonight.
Thank you very much. As I often say, the rabbi of my community when I was growing up used to start his sermon with, "Before I speak, I want to say something." So I too want to say something before I speak. First of all, I want to thank Yedida Ganek, who really put this all together. And it's really a tribute to your community. That's 6 major educational institutions and really the sort of mainstays of Bergen County yeshiva education have gotten together for this event. And it's really certainly something that I'm sure Hashem smiles upon. I also personally want to thank Ohel, our CEO, David Mendel, and Presidium of Mel Zachter and Jay Kestenbaum, who make it possible for me to give these talks, as well as our tech team. Maybe that's a reflection of my age, but I'm very grateful for the guys who make this work, and as well as my trauma team, Sivi Ryder, who co-leads it with me, and Cheryl Chernovsky, who's also been a very important part of these services that we'll be able to provide during this recent crisis. This talk is being recorded, and will be people listed, and somebody wants to hear it. It will be available both on the Ohel website, on YouTube, and I guess if any of the schools want to post it on their website, it'll be made available to them. I used to be able to say we'll have it ready in a day or two. Now it's starting to become a week maybe because of our backlog, but we'll have it ready, and certainly we'll let everybody know when the copy is ready. The main talk is going to be recorded. Sometimes we edit out some of the questions if they look like they'll divulge who the person, it becomes more, is sort of more personal. But for the most part, the questions that we've been getting on other webinars reflect general concerns, and we've been able to include them. Again, as Yedida said, we encourage you to use the chat option. There's too many people to just sort of jump in and speak. So use the chat option to ask questions, add comments, etc. The topic is next steps in supporting our children, and very apt and timely because it looks as if we're starting to emerge from this, or something starting to emerge from the quarantine, and yet there still is a danger. As I'll talk about in a minute, it's a little odd because we're not here or there yet, and there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unknowns. What about the summer camp, school next year? Is it going to be online? Is it going to be in person? And but we certainly need to try to be prepared and help ourselves and our family process these difficulties. So as I said, it's a difficult topic. I'm going to enumerate the problems, and then I'm going to try to give them the solutions. So and again, like any time you speak of something so complex, some of the solutions may make sense to you, some may not make sense for your situation. Trust your intuitive sense of your own situation and your family. This is not one of those kind of situations where we can say one size fits all. But I'll try to give you some ideas that seem to work, and we know from prior issues or what we know just from already seeing people trying to resume some semblance of normal life with everything that's going on. I will also more tangentially address some of the societal unrest as well and how we process that with our children. So first of all, I said it's a difficult subject because it requires predicting. It requires trying to understand where we're going to be in 2 weeks, where we're going to be in 4 weeks, where we're going to be this September. And psychologists' capacity to predict human behavior, even when there's more certainty, has not been proven to be terribly great. Even when we're asked sometimes to predict future behaviors, stability of people that we're working with or we're testifying in court, our capacity to anticipate human behavior has not proven to be a whole lot better than people in general. You know, I like to quote often the great New York philosopher and theologian Yogi Berra, who used to say prognosticating is very difficult, especially about the future. And it is very difficult. So we're going to talk about a lot of unknowns, about we're not sure what's going to be. In fact, I often say that if this past February, someone would have called me about, let's say, a family member or friend who's terribly frightened about a disease, is washing his hands incessantly, won't leave the house without wearing a mask, and won't stay within 6 feet of somebody, at that point I would say this person has a serious anxiety disorder and that needs some serious help. And in recent times, this has been now the normal. So much for predicting the future. And the other thing is as well that we don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty here. That rarely have we had a situation where even experts, government leaders, et cetera, are equivocating. I was speaking to someone the other day whose son is a resident in pulmonary medicine in one of the major teaching hospitals in this country. And says they have weekly meetings and they're constantly contradicting each other. They're floundering as well. And it's not their fault. This is unprecedented. So, and anxiety and ambiguity itself breeds anxiety. It is scary when we don't know. And we're much more comfortable with certainty. Our rabbi said it very well in Simcha Hatarot HaSfekot. We're comfortable with certainty. I don't know how many people have experienced this, but we've certainly experienced in our work on the trauma team. Let's say somebody, Lo Aleinu, is diagnosed with cancer and there's a surgery and they remove the tumor. And the big question is, did the cancer spread to the lymph nodes? And there's testing that's been done and it takes about a week until the tests come back. And even if the tests come back with bad news, and even if tests come back and say, yes, the cancer has spread, many people have said that was psychologically an easier place to be than that week with waiting and the uncertainty. So uncertainty itself breeds a lot of anxiety. And again, we have to, with that, and anxiety on top of anxiety grows exponentially, we have to try to figure out how to process this with our children and how to help ourselves and our children face everything that's going on. So what we're seeing already is actually two extremes. And I think the extremes kind of reflect sometimes what you see in anxiety in general. We are seeing people who are still very trepidous, very worried, and acting very much as if it was still the point when the disease was highly virulent and we couldn't leave our homes and we couldn't go to shul. And the research pours this out because we know from research on cases where they've been quarantined in the past that even when the danger no longer exists, in situations where, let's say, it had been resolved and one can freely engage in communal activities, many people who had been through quarantine enter back very gingerly. It's as if the fear lingers even beyond the time that's necessary. And we're seeing some of that as well, both with ourselves and our children, who are still very afraid even to engage in social contact that's now being permitted by the health experts. I often say that reality always changes quicker than the brain does. So the reality can change, but until we mentally adjust, sometimes takes a lot longer. My one example of that is something many of us have probably witnessed. If you know anybody who had lost a lot of weight, someone who may have been obese and went on this incredible diet and lost 60 pounds, 80 pounds, 100 pounds, and now they're normal looking, normal physique within their range, and they'll look in the mirror and they'll see a fat person because the brain doesn't adjust as quickly as reality. So we're seeing that, a great deal of anxiety. And then we're seeing the other extreme, which is people have just about had it. They're fed up with it. They're fed up with all the restrictions, and they're really basically chucking them all and are sort of scoffing at even some of the standards and, if you will, rules about social distancing or contact that are still being recommended by health departments and the prevailing medical establishment. So, and this, by the way, reflects an issue in anxiety in general. Anxiety is necessary. And the trick is not to have no anxiety or to have a lot of anxiety. The trick is to have the anxiety that is commensurate with the threat that exists. This is borne out by research on test anxiety, that children who have too much anxiety about an exam will not do well on the test because it interferes with their thinking. But if they have too little anxiety, they're just not motivated, they don't care. And the ideal state is a certain amount of anxiety, but not so much so that you become paralyzed. And the same thing is true here, that we, our children, need to have, and we need to have, anxiety and concern that is commensurate with the existing threat. And some of that depends where you are, and some of it depends on, what the best guess, if you will, by the medical experts. So as we emerge from this, and yet while it's still here, we have to be well informed, and we have to try to gauge that our anxiety and our children's concern, anxiety, is present. There needs to be anxiety. This is relevant here, but not so much so that it becomes debilitating. Now, one of the most common questions I'm getting asked on many of these webinars that I'm giving or groups that we're running is the following. I feel that we should have such and such standards for myself and my children, but all their friends are not. Maybe a classic example will be, my feeling is that kids can socialize, but they shouldn't be on top of each other. They shouldn't be playing basketball, or they shouldn't be sitting in such close proximity. And yet all of my sons or daughters' friends are playing ball, or are sitting close, or are talking without masks, etc. And it worries me. On one hand, my child is complaining that why should I be different? And on the other hand, this is the standards I want to have. And how do you negotiate that? So first of all, let me just say from an onset, and this is a common theme that many of us speak about, is before you jump to conclusions, just because your child told you that, call the parents and find out. First of all, they may not be allowing it, and they may be allowing it because their kid said that you're allowing it. I often tell parents, our kids are, during recess, are plotting against us, and we don't talk to each other. So speak to the other parents. You're more often than not, you'll find that their standards or their wishes are probably coincide with yours. And if all of you together will share, these kind of expectations with the children, it'll be much more powerful. But let's say that's not the case. Let's say there really is a difference, or your situation is different. I did a presentation about a week or two ago for the parents from Kids of Courage, and these are children who are with medical vulnerabilities, and therefore those parents have to be even more careful and cautious. And their children are upset because the other children are allowed to have a little more contact and take a little bit more chances, and they have to be extra specially careful because of their medical precariousness. So, but let's say again, even without that, you have your standards in which you're entitled to. Now, there's a body of literature in psychology often referred to as the locus of control, which is how much all of us, let's say how much any of us, how much our behavior is governed by what we internally think is right and what society or what our community expects from us. And all of us somewhere on the continuum fall on one end or the other. Some people are much more self-directed. Some people are very much their own person and they do what they think is right. And some people are more reactive to the community, and most of us fall somewhere in between. And this very much has bearing on this question about how much you just go along with whatever seems to be convention and standards, or how much do you adhere to, for yourself and for your children, what you think is right, what you think is safe. And so therefore, if the standards of the other children are radically different than your own, you might have to re-examine yours. You may have to go to some of the reliable, I'm emphasizing reliable, sources of information, medical information, et cetera, and just check if you're maybe adhering, as I mentioned earlier, which is human nature, adhering to standards that are no longer necessary, and you may have to adjust yourself. But also, you may have to, you can say, let's say you check into it, you have these standards, you can say to your child, but this is our standards. And we don't have to, I'm going to do what I think is right. No, I'm doing what's right for our family, what I think is the proper direction. You don't have to necessarily do what everybody else is doing. That's a hard message. And it may have some bearing on the age of your child. Younger children will tend to be more obedient. So an elementary school age child, if you put your foot down and you're clear about it, they'll just go along with it, even if they're unhappy. But they are at the age where they want to be very much part of the group. They don't want to stick out. They don't want to be different. So with these children, something you might have to actually tell them that they can't play right now with the other children, because it'll be very hard for them to be different. teenagers, the adolescents, are going to be much more, not much more, but they'll probably be more tolerant of differences. It's an age where they're more accepting of differences, but however, they also have more of a rebellious streak. So just because you say so, they're not going to feel necessarily obliged to go along with the standards that you're imposing upon them. I would tell you, unless there is someone in your home that's immune deficient, and there really is a risk, I'm not sure it's worth having a big battle with your, especially your teen, over this, even if they are taking more chances than you think are warranted. Because one of the very important needs right now is that for family cohesiveness. We're not out as much. We're under a lot of pressure and stress, and we're being more lenient, and we're avoiding conflict much more than we would have maybe otherwise. And you're going to have to weigh that. If let's say your child is just resisting the standards that you think are appropriate, it may be worthwhile to just bend on yourself just to avoid conflict. It doesn't mean you have to agree with him. And this is an important point in parenting in general. You can let a teenager know you disagree. You can let them know that that you think what you're doing is wrong, but you don't have to necessarily get into a battle in order to enforce it. The other thing, by the way, difference between teenagers and younger children with these kind of issues is that the younger child, you really can just sort of say, this is our standard. They don't necessarily need a rationale. With a teen, you're going to be much more prone to give explanations and to give rationales. But again, you're going to have to make that judgment call because, and as I said, this must be happening a lot, and maybe it's a reflection of some of the uncertainty and the confusion about this issue in general, because there are very many different standards, both among adults and children. And I know that many people are struggling with that. And again, this is not something that looks like is going to resolve itself overnight. And as it progresses, and there's even a remote possibility, I hope not, that there may be a resurgence, and we're seeing that in some areas of the country, and we saw it in Israel. So it's going to be standards that are going to have to be constantly adjusted and finessed. By the way, again, I invite anybody who has questions, comments, etc., please use the chat. There's a chat icon at the bottom of your computer. You can direct the question or comment directly to me if you don't want it, and I will not divulge who asked it. If you don't want to even broadcast it at all, then just mention that in the chat. But if a private one comes to me, I'll just anonymously read the question or the comment. And if you want to make it to everybody, that's at your discretion. Now, let me talk in general about this whole uncertainty, which is, as I said, a very big part of this. This is an unprecedented event, and it's scary, and just because of the ambiguity that exists, and as I mentioned, ambiguity itself is fraught with tension. So I think there are basically two approaches that we're proposing to parents to deal with this ambiguity in general. One of them is, I mentioned that we're not very good at predicting the future, but there is one criteria that seems to have some merit in terms of predicting the future, and that's the past. It seems that whatever has been, there's a greater likelihood that it will be. It's a little bit like whoever doesn't learn from history is destined to repeat it. And so therefore, if we can look historically, we know that prior pandemics and even prior periods of social or political unrest have always had a beginning, middle, and an end. It's never really lasted forever. Now, of course, there's fallout, the casualties along the way, and those are terribly tragic. But I think we can say to ourselves, and I think we can say to our teens, this will ultimately resolve itself. This will ultimately, and there will be a point when we will be going to school again. We'll be going back to shul, we'll have camp. You'll be able to freely communicate with others. That seems to be historically the case, and for the most part, what has been will be. So I think you can say that to them if they're overly worried about the uncertainty, if they're going to ask you what's going to be. You can't necessarily tell them what will be. And in fact, one of the themes that have emerged from what's happening now is that we're focusing much more on what we're doing and not what will be, because we just don't know. This is, we're going to get back to that when we talk about camp. But that's one approach. And the other approach, by the way, which is a very religious one and appropriate for the audience here, which is to embrace the ambiguity. Because that's really what Emunah is. Emunah is that we believe that Hashem is, even if it's totally inexplicable to us, is doing something that's for our betterment, the betterment of the world. And we resign ourselves to the fact that we don't understand, that we don't know. And it may be a very good opportunity, especially in the world we live in today, where we're very used to knowing everything. We have technology, we can find that, we can click a mouse and find out anything, we can communicate with anybody, and we're not used to being so confounded. But there is perhaps the hidden benefit that it's an opportunity for us to sort of resign ourselves to it and to just trust that Hashem has, that there is a greater plan, and that works very nicely with our belief system, or any religious belief system, any spiritual system. I'm reminded of a situation once, and many of you may know, I've done a lot of work in bereavement, and particularly a parental loss of a child. And I was once speaking to a group of bereaved parents, and I mentioned that I've been doing this for many years, and I've worked with hundreds of bereaved parents, and the numbers that have gone off the derech, who have abandoned religion, I could count on the finger of one hand. And I said that, something like that just amazes me. And one of the parents came to me afterwards and said, "Why are you so surprised? Where else are we going to turn?" And so I guess this is also an opportunity when there's so much uncertainty and we're so confounded, where we can sort of take that position, which is, where else are we going to return? Okay, I see some chats came through, so let me just quickly, address them. So what would you consider an acceptable level of anxiety right now? I can't give it a number. It's hard to say, but I think it seems, and again, from my understanding, that right now in the tri-state area, the virulence of the virus has gone down. There aren't as many cases. I'm certain that's what the government is reporting. That's what Hatzalah is reporting. So it seems that the social distancing that we've engaged in has reduced the incidence of cases, and people are starting to go back. So I think, again, we still have to be anxious. We still have to be alert. I don't think we have to be to the same extent that we were previously. However, it's still there. And then again, for those people who are taking this sort of more casual attitude and just not caring, we're seeing in other places a resurgence. So I think we still have to be alert, and we have to be careful, and we have to adhere to the standards that are being recommended, but we can lighten up a little bit. It's always easy to go to extremes, but to adjust slightly and commensurate with the risk that exists, I think, is appropriate. But I can't give you an exact criteria, and people are going to respond differently. People have different levels of risk taking, and even within the norm. I'm not talking about even extremes, and some of it may be just your tolerance for risk, and also the reality of your circumstances, of your health and the health of those in your family. Okay, any recommendations for Shabbat as a family? Is home right now, long days are especially difficult, summertime. Okay, yes, it somehow, it's an interesting thing, but somehow or another, the summer Shabbat seems longer than the winter Shabbat. It's the same amount of hours, but it's somehow broken up with a night's sleep. It seems more time, and that day is very long. I think, human beings have a natural need for novelty, and so do children. And when that novelty is limited because we're confined to the home and we can't socialize as much, we have to be creative, and people are, in terms of entertainment, fun, different types of activities that they're engaging in. And yes, in Shabbat, you may have to, stretch the wallet and buy more games and do creative, even silly things. But to introduce as much as you can, especially for children, an element of novelty and excitement, which is what is a natural need. There is a lot online, a lot of excellent suggestions and ideas, and recommendations for making, for creative kind of activities with children. But I would also not make it oppressive and overbearing with what's going on right now. So it wouldn't be, I wouldn't give them this intense partial quiz, but light and fun types of activities, readings, games would certainly be indicated. Okay, we're going to do a question about camp. and starting to get together with grandparents. So I think, so the question is here, so the best way to handle kids going to camp, we're going to get to camp in a minute. And what about grandparents? And they're not going to be socially distancing with friends in camps, but they need to socially distance from grandparents. It's very tragic. It's very sad that grandparents, that there has to be this schism now between kids and grandparents are very important people in many respects. Grandparents represent the unadulterated love, which is important to have. And I feel personally very much, because I have not grown up with grandparents, and I've watched it and witnessed it with my children, and now as a grandfather, that's a very important experience. I have just an example. I have an ongoing joke with my grandchildren when they are not nice to me or something like that. I look very mean. I say, you know what I do to grandchildren who do whatever happens to be? And they know already. They say, yeah, nothing. I said, that's right. And that's what I'm going to do. Because that's what a grandparent is. A grandparent is not the disciplinarian. And the grandparent is the link to the past, which is very important. But again, older people have more, do not have this robust immune system and are much more at risk. And if you look at some of the statistics in terms of fatalities from this illness, it's way disproportionate to the elderly. And so we have to take these kind of precautions. And that's a differentiation children can understand. They can understand that it's more risky to older people and that we're having different standards for, it's a concrete, obvious differentiation, which I think kids can manage. Okay, should I ask, does emotional health risk outweigh the physical risk by sending kids to backyard camps? Does it depend on the age of the kid? Very good question. And I think we're going to get to that in a minute, because camp, we'll get there. Camp is not a luxury anymore. Camp is really, not going to say a life and death necessity, but it's really a very important part of the child's landscape and year, and not one that we give up very easily. So I'll get to that in a minute. How do we prevent passing our own anxiety to our children? Excellent question, because anxiety is very contagious, and it needs to be contagious. If you look at it from like an evolutionary perspective, the fact that we can impart anxiety to somebody else very effectively ensured our safety. Or I'll give an example that maybe many of you can relate to. The first time your toddler wandered into the street or nearly wandered into the street, you gave them a lot of anxiety. You scared the living daylights out of them, and thank God for that, because they'll never do it again. And maybe in the good old days when we used to have marauders and invaders and stuff like that, and the capacity to mobilize the town to defend itself and make them anxious was necessary for survival. So we pass on anxiety very easily, and we are not going to prevent passing on our own anxiety to our children. And if your feeling is that you yourself are overly anxious, or if you're prone to more anxiety, because certainly people who have a predisposition to anxiety, it's going to be increased under these circumstances, then you got to take care of it yourself before you address it with children. Again, very much like putting on the oxygen on yourself before you put it on your child. And by the way, if that means a quick fix when everything is so crazy right now, so then you take medication. A psychiatrist friend of mine told me that he wants a Klonopin dispenser in his office, and CVS is reporting, I think, a 30% increase in anti-anxiety medication. Rightfully so. There are other non-medical ways to address anxiety, which if times were easier and less stressful, and we had access to, although we have now more access to medical care, so maybe we can, but if we don't, then we need the quick fixes until this thing resolves. And if you're going to stay anxious, yes, you will pass it on to your children. And anxiety, again, it's not good to have too much. It's not good to have too little. And sometimes for a child who is, as I said, anxiety averse, is more of a daredevil and all that, you have to make them anxious. But as long as you're doing it deliberately, not because you're imparting your own anxiety. Do you have any recommendations for screen time, Ivy? We have been working from home and find it hard to manage all of the unstructured time at home, but also I don't want their brains to turn into mush. Good question. So our general position has been, whatever your standards are, don't give them up. Don't hand your kid over to Fortnite, because they'll be double mush. But we're also extending. We're being a little bit more lenient, because again, these are difficult times. Kids there's a whole very long days, and it's hopefully temporary. But I would say to you that if you are, let's say, more generously indulging them in devices and things like that, let them know that this is temporary right from the onset, so that doesn't become habitual. Let them know that as long as we're in this crisis, we're going to be more, we're going to be more lenient about this. But once things start resolving, so they know right in their head to begin with, we're going to go back to our prior standards. I previously ran a group for parents of children with disabilities, and one parent was telling me how she's fighting with her kid all the time about how long he's on his devices. I was encouraging her to, it's not worth the conflict. Let it, give in a little bit. In fact, I even told her when all this is over, I'll help her get the kid off the devices if my wife can get me off my devices, because this is a crisis. And we may need to, we're just trying to get through it in one piece. And right now, the tranquility of the home, the shalom bayis, is very important when we're going through these kind of stresses. I'm seeing back in anger in my son. I won't say the age, so it doesn't, but let's say a middle school age child. There hasn't been any particular triggers, and the redundancy of corona life and lack of social life. The explosive behavior is very difficult. How do you address and die down these anger outbursts? Okay. So children sometimes are kind of imprecise with their responses. Sometimes, when they're anxious, they're angry, and when they're sad, or when they're scared, they cry, or, and it could very well be that it is his frustration, and that it is, his fright or fear, and so then, he may be expressing it through anger outbursts, and you want to examine that. First of all, your child. So if it is sudden, and if it is very out of character for him, that might be his concern. And very often when children have concerns that they have trouble expressing directly, and usually when they have trouble expressing it directly, it comes out in misconduct or disturbed sleep or stomach aches, etc. The best thing sometimes to do is create opportunities for them to open up more. So to try to create a connection with the child, whether it's a walk, whether it's, I got to take a drive, come spend some time with me, and see then if the child opens up. And again, when I say be more lenient, doesn't mean just let everything go. You may have to draw the line. Some of it may also be just being cooped up with sibling rivalry is very normal. But when you're there all day, and if there was already, let's say prior to this crisis, there was a tense relationship, but manageable, there might have been a few, little spites, little arguments here and there, but now is more manageable. With this situation, it's going to come out all the more, and then maybe the child does need opportunities to get out of the home or outlets, etc. Again, I will mention that sometimes, some of the questions may be very specific. I can say for Ohel, and I'm sure I'm speaking for Jewish Family Service and all the other very fine agencies that exist, but we at Ohel, the trauma team is available to people who want assistance. You can get our, you can go on the website and ask for assistance, and we're offering it obviously no charge, full confidentiality, not therapy, but more intervention and discussion, maybe a handful of meetings via Zoom to help with more specific situations. So I'm saying I'm really getting bogged down with the questions, but let me see if I can get through the others, and then I'll try to get to some other important issues. Any of us parents supporting children who have a hard time entertaining themselves without structure and are not receptive to suggestions? Very good idea. It's true. Children differ in their capacity to self-entertain. If you have a kid who's a reader or who has a particular hobby or interest or is very imaginative, some children are just very capable to sit with their action figures and create all sorts of stories, etc. And they're easier in these circumstances. The child who's very dependent on social interactions with peers or very dependent on outside stimulation or don't have the wherewithal to entertain themselves will have a harder time and may not be as receptive. And sometimes that means you do have to spend more time with that child. An important aspect of child rearing is not to have to be 100% even with each child. My father, Olav Shalom, used to say when he, at the Shabbos table, that he has to count the bubbles in the Pepsi Cola. You can't give out everybody. It's to give each child what they need. And sometimes some children have greater needs than others. So, but to whatever extent you can, and they're going to have a harder time. Those type of children are going to have a hard time, but it may demand of you more of your time and attention, or you're coming up with activities for them, or more time on Zoom with friends or through, again, with oversights, social media. Okay, you know what? I'm going to just go ahead a little bit. I know I didn't get to every question. I hope I'll get to them. There's some very important the important issues to talk about that I want to address. So let me go a little further with my speech, and then I'll get back to some of the chats, okay? First, I want to mention a little bit about the social unrest and the political unrest, which I think is important. We can't ignore it, although it could probably be a topic unto itself. This is going to be, it's tension on the top of other tension, which is always, the mathematics of stress and trauma is that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, 2 + 2 = 8. But I would just a few pointers in terms of how to process this with your children. First of all, for elementary school age children, it's going to be very hard to understand that a figure like a police officer who is seen as heroic, is portrayed as heroic in much of the media, portrayed as heroic sometimes in terms of the kind of person who will come to the school and talk about safety, that the person who is seen in a heroic role, that certain individuals could behave in a more reprehensible fashion. That's a very hard thing for an elementary school child to understand. A teenager can get that. A teenager can understand the nuances of human behavior. A teenager can understand that someone can assume a position of responsibility and behave irresponsibly or something along those lines. So the story behind a lot of the social unrest is going to be easier to process with a teen than with an elementary school age child. An elementary school age child, you need to develop your own narrative, your own explanation. And I can't tell you what that is. It's an individual one, but should be more clear and should be less complicated. Whereas for the teenager, it can be a little bit more complex. However, the teens also can be very idealistic and can be very passionate. They're at an age where there's a heightened emotionality. They're much more aware of what's going on in the world and things are new. And again, if you remember back to your days when you were a teenager, you feel everything in an incredibly passionate way. And since this does involve certain causes and certain outlooks, etc., that people are very passionate about, your teen may be very passionate about it as well. If you want to make sure that your teen has the exact opposite position that you do, argue with them, because the more you're going to argue with them, the more they're going to dig in their heels. If your child does take a position that you find somehow not suitable or appropriate or bothers you as well, and there's a lot of passion about what's going on, just focus on the fact that yes, there are differences, that people have different points of view. But it would not, especially under these circumstances, I don't think it makes sense to get into heated disputes with your teenagers. And this, by the way, also speaks to another very important issue in this current crisis, which is how we process the news and information that we're getting. The way we get news and information has changed radically in recent years. There's a plethora of news sources, many admittedly biased, and you can get literally bombarded. And because the competition is so fierce between the different providers of news and information, they're more prompted then to try to present it in a sensationalized way. So there's going to be very captivating headlines, presenting truths that may not be so true, or distorting the severity of a problem. It may look like there's total social unrest and anarchy in the country, and yet it might be isolated incidents and not so prevalent. So you have to teach our children and teach ourselves how to use the proverbial grain of salt, how to filter, how to find reliable news sources, and not to be bombarded either, how to contain it and decide how, because again, there's plenty of data that people who allow themselves to be deluged by news information as is available today online, that in and of itself engenders a great deal of panic and anxiety, and is not the best way necessarily to understand what's happening in the world around us. So let me now talk about summer camp, which is a very important issue. And as I alluded to earlier, in our world today, summer camp is not a luxury. Summer camp is part of the child's framework, of child's sort of time landscape. And these 2 months of, recreational activities, sports, more independence from parents, more intense socialization is a very important part of their life, a very important part of their development, and pretty universal. I mean, not every child takes kindly to sleepaway camp, and that's not necessarily a negative reflection of the child. Some people just don't like, daddy long legs crawling around them at night, or want their creature comforts, or don't want the structure of a camp. And that's okay. Don't worry about your child if they don't want to go to sleepaway camp. But if we put together between camp, day camp, and teen tours and travel camps, it's part of their childhood. It really is, for most kids, it's part of their childhood. And it's a big loss if they're not having it, or if it's going to be significantly truncated. And number one, first thing to do is commiserate. Don't try to minimize what's missing now and what's missing for them. It's a big setback, and we can't do anything about it, but we can be sympathetic, and we can acknowledge it. And that's what we're doing nowadays. As I said, we're focusing much more, because we're so much we can't have, and we're not used to this, is we're focusing much more on what we're doing and what we're trying to do about this. The other question is, and I think this is something we have to think about, is will our children, let's see and assume school resumes in September, will our children be as replenished? And will they be as relaxed as they would have been otherwise, and ready to start the new school year? And I think, and I see that there are many mental health professionals from the schools online here. I think we have to start wondering if they're not going to have that more typical summer. If when school resumes, can we expect them to right away be able to learn as much as they do, or do as much of the work, or acclimate to the structure of school, or acclimate socially? And we may have to ease into school more slowly, because besides the long absence from that kind of setting, they may not be as relaxed and as replenished as they would have been otherwise. But one point that might help is this also might be an opportunity, if they have less activities in the summer, to actually nurture some skills. And I don't mean math and Aramaic for Gemara, but some of the more outlet types of activities that are important, such as music lessons, maybe to some extent even some sports. I mean, it may not be sports of training that involve close proximity, but developing ball handling skills, or tennis, or something which may not be as close, or for that matter, woodworking, art. These, especially with our yeshiva schedules, is not always easy to develop these skills, and this may be a golden opportunity to give our children some of those lessons in those areas. First of all, again, it gives them something that's important to do in the summer, and these may be lifelong important outlets. What's generally recommended in these kind of situations is to size up your child. What's their natural gift? You can't just create, you can't take a tone deaf kid and make them into a singer. But if your child has a musical acumen, or if your child just by nature is athletic, or by nature is a good dancer or something like that, the research on people who have developed, even in the research on people who have become like stars, is very often what happens is a parent at a very young age detects the natural acumen and then nurtures it through instruction and opportunities. And this may be a time where something like this can be done. But again, it's a big loss. And apropos to that, let me just go, maybe take a look at questions. I don't want to totally ignore them, so let me take a look. Okay. Okay, so many anxiety types of activity that come out by not being in school or social. Should you ignore it? Okay, I don't want to mention the specific ones, because it might sort of highlight who's asking that question. But some of those more anxiety-induced behaviors are coming out much more because of the isolation. And could they last? And that's a very good question, because sometimes behaviors that are linked to a particular stressful event, may have occurred to a stressful event, can take on a life of their own. We in psychology call it becoming functionally autonomous. In Gemara, we talk about toshel lishma balishma. That it could be, let's say a child develops a tic of some sort because of the tension, and then even when the tension is gone, the tic will persist. So it is important to address these behaviors as soon as possible. And if you can do all the things we're talking about to try to reduce some of the anxiety, but I would move in on those kind of behaviors, even though they probably never would come out if we weren't living in such stressful times, but they can take on a life of their own. Okay. A parent No, Ohel is serving the world right now. Someone said that they called and they were not eligible, or maybe for therapy. I'm not sure what, well, okay, so let me just mention in terms of services that we're offering, Ohel does have 2 fee-for-service clinics in New York, in Flatbush and in Far Rockaway, that may be limited to New York. That could be because they're funded programs from New York. The trauma team is servicing, I mean, I've been working, I work with people in Australia and the United Kingdom. So we're not confined to in a geographical way. Our funding is very different. But that's for trauma interventions. For actual psychotherapy, if you need weekly psychotherapy sessions, I know that the Jewish Family Services in Jersey are doing Zoom therapy. And I'm sure there are others as well. I don't want to promote just one agency. So that you'd have to go probably locally, because that could also be a licensing issue. But in terms of trauma interventions, contact the trauma team, either contact me in fact, maybe the best thing is our secretary, the address is Laura_Bart, B-A-R-T, at ohelfamily.org, Ohel_Bart at ohelfamily.org, and tell them that you wanted a session with a member of the trauma team, and we'll make ourselves available. If there are any other questions you want to direct to me, so you need then other people who know how to reach me. I don't want to just give out my cell phone number, but it's a little risky. But I'm happy to be of assistance if I can. Okay, so that gives us some time to talk about another very important issue, which is what happens when we're going back to school. Let's say school does resume. How do we do that? So first of all, if school is opening up, and that, by the way, would apply to camps as well, there has to be a very clear and consistent message of what health precautions or practices are going to be promoted. It's unlikely that we're going to completely rid the world of this disease by September. We may have it sufficiently under control that we can have school resume, especially elementary school, because it doesn't seem to affect children as profoundly. But with obviously there's going to be some new protocols and routine, and whatever they happen to be, the more consistent they are, the better. And we have 6 schools online here, and so if the schools can work together and the messages are consistent, that'll be important. And the parents have to know that you're taking the safety and well-being of the children very seriously with very clear criteria. You can't, if you're gonna have anxious parents, you can't send them to school. The child will not be able to function in school if the parents are anxious. It very much reminds me of, there was a very famous psychiatrist who was the founder of the American School of Psychiatry. His name was Harry Stack Sullivan. And he used to tell the residents he was training that when you do psychotherapy, there should be only one anxious person in the room, preferably not the therapist. And the same thing here is true. You should not have anxious parents. So the communication and the criteria should be made as clear as possible. And by the way, very important is that you can't just tell the kids, okay, here's the first day of school and we're just getting started. They're going to need to process everything they've been through and everything that has happened. And this may have to be done, can be done collectively through an assembly, can be done in class, but this has been a traumatic times, and you can't just, human beings need that to be addressed and spoken about in order to function. There was a very famous study done a number of years ago. It was done in Nepal. It was done by a Dr. Brandon Kerr, who was from George Washington University. And it seems that what was happening at the time, children from Nepal, and by the way, this is a familiar story for us as Jews, but from ages 5 to 14 were put into conscription, put into army service for many, many years, like the Tsar had done to us in the turn of the 20th century, and came back 10 years later, 15 years later to their town, having witnessed terrible atrocities and being highly traumatized. And this Dr. Carr studied how the towns received these children, now adults, coming back from this traumatic experience. And the towns that commemorated it, that celebrated it, that had some sort of parade or something like that, versus the towns that just let the people come back and didn't do much of anything, the ones who commemorated it, the adjustment and the trauma was much less than those that came back without any kind of recognition. So this has to be spoken about and processed as the kids come back. And that'll be an important part, again, of the returning. And last, I'm just going to take a quick look at the chats, and then I have we'll have just some final points. Okay. Okay, what about social distancing in schools? Isn't it possible that will wear out students more being in person in such restricted ways? And for teachers as well, burnout will likely happen really fast. What are your thoughts? I think it depends how it's done. I think if it's consistent and clear, and it's allowing for safe socialization. I mean, if we're in a situation medically where people have to be 15 feet apart, I'm not sure if we'll be able to open up schools. But if the situation's under better control and with proper hygiene and containment, children can be in a school setting, and as long as it's consistent, kids are incredibly adaptable. Again, I'll tell a personal experience. After many weeks not seeing my grandchildren, we did come to see them outdoors. And my 4-year-old granddaughter saw us, hadn't seen us in a while, it was real exciting, went running over and exactly 6 feet stopped dead in her tracks. She got it in her head. She knew it. She knew she couldn't just come running into our arms. Kids will follow if it's clear and it's consistently, practiced. If it's going to be inconsistent, or if the needs for social distancing can be so extreme, then maybe school can't be opened. We'll have to see. It's an unknown, but it can be done. My guess is it'll be a very different, I think it'll be a different, that's actually my last topic, which is what's the world going to look like when we come out of this? And I think that's something we all have to think about. And I'm sure schools will be different. And I think the world may be different. I don't think we're just going to, this is not an event. This is too big. It's just going to be sort of filed away and as some quirk that happened and not impacting us. I don't know. But I think we have to think about, will our outlook towards disease and health change, or medical care for that matter? Because obviously the physicians, that what's been standard medical practice is not so applicable here. How are we going to socialize? Are we going to shake hands? Or are we going to bow like the Japanese? Will there be social hugs? Are we going to converse in close proximity? Because even if we get the vaccine and the cure for this disease, who's to say it's not going to be another one? And will the manner and fashion in which we socialize in general, is it going to change? What are racial relationships going to be like in this country? What's law enforcement going to look like when all this is over? City dwelling. There's already some indication that people don't want to live in such highly congested areas like the city. Are we going to see more moving to suburbia or rural areas? Will the city not be what the city has been till now? Will we recover financially? Or will we be living more modestly? Will we have smaller weddings, smaller bar mitzvahs, not dressing in such a fancy way? And what about the technology and the communicating remotely? Are we going to have more people working from home? And then I think the last question, which I think we'll have to start thinking about, which is, what are we going to learn from this? And again, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I know why this had to happen, only Hashem did, but it's human nature when we're in a traumatic experience to try to cull lessons. So we call it post-traumatic growth, to try to look and see what we can learn, how we can grow from this. Not because we know why this had to happen, but it chips away from the pain of the situation. Are we going to be more appreciative of shuls? Are we going to daven differently? I know my grandson had his bar mitzvah Shabbos HaGadol, so obviously he didn't have it. But we had a Tuesday night Zoom bar mitzvah, and we let him read his first 2 aliyahs, and my daughter muted everybody. And afterwards, the rabbi spoke. He said, I never heard the shul so quiet during Kriyas Torah. He wants to get that mute button before everybody comes back to shul. But are we going to be different? Now that we appreciate shul more, are we going to be humbled? And these are questions we have to think about, because something like this doesn't happen just randomly. But on the other hand, also, we have to be very careful to preserve what many of our time-honored traditions and not let them go by the wayside because there is so much upheaval. And I think that's what we do as modern Orthodox Jews. We're not completely steeped in just tradition and ignore changes that happen around us, nor do we, as other people do, just shun all tradition and just go with whatever happens to be popular. We always sort of live in both worlds, and we're trying to preserve what we had and at the same time adapt and adjust it to the new realities. When I was thinking about this, I was actually reminded of a story that my mother told me, and I'll share with it, and that conclude. My mother was a Holocaust survivor who survived 7 concentration camps. And at the very end of the war, she was on the notorious death marches, which they went through Europe, cleaning up from the Allied bombings, cleaning up the rubble. And for a period of time, she was in Altona in Hamburg, which was a port cities in northern Germany, and were bombed incessantly by the Allies because the ports were very important for supplies. And one day she was going to wherever they were heading to clean up rubble, and she saw a horrific, grotesque sight. It seemed like the night before, the Allies had bombed an apartment building and the residents were running out, and from the heat, the asphalt melted. And then as they were running out, they got stuck in the asphalt and it hardened again, and they literally burned to death, stuck in asphalt. And she saw literally these figurines of human beings stuck in the cement and burned to death. And she felt terribly sorry for them. And then she got very confused for a moment. She said, wait a minute, these are the Nazis. These are the people that have incarcerated me for the last few years, starved me and killed off my family. Why am I feeling sorry for them? She was very confused. And then she said she had an exhilarating experience. It dawned on her that although she's lived under such inhumane conditions for so long, she can still feel sorry for someone. And she described it as an exhilarating experience, that she still has the capacity to empathize and feel sorry. And I think that's very much what we're going to be doing. And I think that's what we have to start thinking about and processing in these next steps with our children. What are we going to learn? How are we going to be different? And what are we going to preserve? So I hope, let me just make a quick look if I see a chat thing up. Oh, it was just a thank you. Okay, you're welcome. All right, I hope this has been helpful. Again, I thank all of the schools, and I'm moved by the unity. And I thank Edita again for orchestrating this. And we're available, as I'm sure many other agencies are, but those who wish to be in touch with us with more specific issues, please feel free to contact us. Okay, Edita, closing remarks? Or?
No, just thank you so much, Dr. Blumenthal. We really appreciate all the advice and guidance. And everyone, feel free to be in touch if any questions come up. And thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. Okay, have a good night, everybody, and be well. Everybody should be healthy.